There are numerous examples of absurd behavior we observe in modern culture with respect to Islamic extremism. I can cite copious amounts of sources on each point I have in this video, but for brevity, I'll limit the citations to just the essentials. When extremist imams in Texas, California, New Jersey, and Canada call for the extermination of the Jews, the mainstream media rushes to their aid to tell us that they didn't actually mean what they said. In 2009 in Fort Hood, Texas, when Major Nadal Hassan, a U.S. Army psychiatrist, fatally shot 13 people and injured 30 others. His attack was labeled for several years after as domestic violence. Major Hassan had given talks on jihad in front of his psychiatrist peers. He had links to terrorist groups overseas and was monitored by the FBI. When he carried out his shooting spree, he shouted, "Allahu Akbar." Classifying Major Hassan's shooting as domestic violence set the standard for deliberately miscategorizing jihad attacks for many years under the Obama administration. In Canada and parts of Europe, jihadists are rebranded foreign fighters, are welcomed back to jobs and free homes as part of a reintegration process. Hillary Clinton said we should silence the criticism of religion, using some old-fashioned techniques of peer pressure and shaming, but not just any religion. She was giving a speech to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. Barack Obama said, "I consider it part of my responsibility as President of the United States to fight against negative stereotypes of Islam wherever they occur." And silencing the criticism of Islam is gaining momentum. Brigitte Gabriel, referring to her speech at the University of Detroit at Ann Arbor, required 9 security officers and a K-9 unit to sniff the auditorium for bombs an hour before she spoke. Others expressing conservative views at universities in the U.S. are met with staged walkouts, prohibitively harassed throughout their speeches, and require increasingly rigorous security measures to ensure their safety. Resolution M103 was passed in Canada in March of 2017, which criminalizes speech deemed Islamophobic. All this brings a series of questions any rational person would ask. Why are extreme imams defended by the mainstream media? Why are the motives behind jihad attacks concealed or denied? Why is Islam singled out for protection against criticism when every other religion has undergone centuries of criticism, both by laymen and scholars alike? Why is free speech silenced using fascist methodology when it intersects with Islam? The answer is Neo-Marxism. Neo-Marxists dominate many of our influential academic institutions throughout the U.S. as well as the political left. This is the driving ideology behind the behavior we observe in Western culture today. Islam, Marxism, and leftists have some very significant points in common. They are all anti-Western and revolutionary. First, some similarities between Islam and Marxism. Islam views Western culture as a barrier to the implementation of its ideology. Surah 364 in the Quran says, "Say, O people of the Scripture, come to a word that is equitable between you and us, that we will not worship except Allah, and not take one another as lords instead of Allah." Surah 931, "They have taken their scholars and monks as lords besides Allah." Now this requires a little bit of unpacking. In Tafsir Ibn Kathir, he quotes a narration where Muhammad's interlocutor says, "O Prophet of Allah, they do not worship the rabbis and monks." Muhammad replied, "Whatever their priests and rabbis call permissible, they accept as permissible. Whatever they declare as forbidden, they consider as forbidden, and thus they worship them." So from the Islamic perspective, obeying man-made laws, that is, not living in a theocracy, is to worship men. It's a form of idolatry. Further, to overcome this barrier, Islam requires a revolution. In the context of these people who make other men lords over themselves, Surah 929 says, "Fight those who believe not in Allah nor the last day," and of course ends with talking about paying the jizya, which is a special tax levied on the people of the book, with willing submission and feeling themselves subdued. Sayyid Qutb also refers to this narration and section in the Quran when he says, "Strike hard at all those political powers which force people to bow before them and rule over them, which prevent people from listening to the preaching and accepting the belief if they wish to do so." After annihilating the tyrannical force, Islam establishes a new social, economic, and political system in which the concept of freedom of man is applied in practice. He says there is also no recourse but to remove them by force, so that when it is addressed to people's hearts and minds, they are free to accept or reject it with an open mind. To understand what's being said here, imagine Allah and the message of Islam on the left, and then in between you have the monolithic establishment of Western culture, and then on the right side you have the individual person. Now, the monolithic establishment of Western culture is composed of individual people. However, those individual people are part of a system. And as part of that system, they are all guilty of interfering with the message of Allah and Islam to those individual people. As such, they actually inhibit the free will of those individual people to respond to the message of Islam. And only by demolishing this barrier can the message of Islam reach the individual person, and they can freely respond to it. In the same way, Neo-Marxism views Western culture as a barrier to the implementation of its ideology. Marxism requires a revolution to overcome this barrier in the same way that Islam does. One quote from the Communist Manifesto will suffice to demonstrate both of these points. In short, the communists everywhere support every revolutionary movement against the existing social and political order of things. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Now, what about similarities of Marxism and the left? Leftists fully embrace Marx's categories of oppressors and oppressed. They are so stricken with cultural guilt that white Europeans have been almost unanimously identified as the oppressive ruling class. This class has only become superior over other groups, according to them, by subjugation. Additionally, Marx disliked religion, the opium of the masses, because it allowed the proletariat to live happily. But Marx needed a revolution, and happiness doesn't start a revolution. Outrage does. Leftist narratives are designed to offend and incense, not convey the truth. Leftist groups compete for the category of most oppressed and invent distressed labels to describe the oppressed groups they identify with, as well as invent labels to condemn those who contradict their worldview. And now Islam and the left. As I demonstrated above, Western culture is a barrier to Islamic and Neo-Marxist ideology, and only a revolution can demolish this barrier. Now back to the questions I put up at the beginning of the video. Why are extreme imams defended by the mainstream media? Because these imams, according to Neo-Marxist ideology, are only saying the things they say because they are oppressed. They're just acting out of oppression. It's not ideological. Why are jihadists rebranded foreign fighters in Canada and welcomed back from the Islamic State with jobs and free housing? Again, because they are simply acting out of oppression. There's no ideology driving their behavior. What about the motives behind jihad attacks? Why are they concealed or denied? Again, the motives behind jihad attacks, according to Neo-Marxist ideology, is oppression. The motives for jihad attacks can never be viewed as religious under Neo-Marxism. Why is Islam singled out for protection against criticism when every other religion has undergone centuries of criticism, both by laymen and scholars? Most Muslims are minority groups, people of color, people in the Near East who have been subjugated under the oppression and imperialism of the West. And oppressed groups cannot be criticized. All this does is further the oppression. Why is free speech silenced using fascist methodology when it intersects with Islam? Because nothing I've described in this video is defensible using rational argumentation. None of it makes sense. And so those who disagree with these self-identified oppressed groups are criticized using one-word descriptions. They have to silence criticism using fascist methodology. Silence is the only option. They dare not engage critics of their ideology in rational debate. And so I conclude that Islamic ideology and leftist Neo-Marxism are all united in an unholy trinity. They abhor the Western economic, social, and political systems, and they're not afraid of using revolution to break down the barriers and advance their ideology.